How's it going, everybody? My name is LeeWood, and I'm the discipleship pastor here at Immanuel Baptist Church. And I just wanted to shoot this quick video to give us a little bit of information about our upcoming spring 2024 Equipping Institute semester and the content that we're going to be covering on Wednesday nights whenever we talk about 1 John. And so I wanted to shoot this to kind of give us that information. That way, when we start up here in about 2 or 3 weeks, that we are not going to be behind the 8 ball and having to do a whole lot of preparatory work. I just want to go ahead and cover that now. And so we're going to cover a bunch of different things here in this session. And I want to just kind of run through exactly what it is that I'm going to cover. That way we know what actually is going to be happening in this video. So what we're going to cover this week or in this session is we're going to talk about what my goals are in teaching just in general. And then also the way that I'm going to go about teaching these things. We're going to talk about how this series is going to be a little bit different than the one we had last semester. And then we're going to talk about how we need to prepare for each week. And then lastly, we'll have a couple of slides that's going to show basically some of that background information that we're going to talk about in 1 John, but we're not going to have so much time at the very beginning, in the beginning of the first week, to talk about this. So we're going to cover some of that now. Yeah. So what we're going to do, we're going to work through this stuff. We're going to start off with what my goals are in teaching. And so whenever I talk about how I teach, whenever I am talking about a small group, a Bible study, or even whenever I'm doing like big sermon series, whether it's at the BCM or something like what we do on Wednesday nights, I only have just a handful of goals. And those are really summarized in 3 big things. Number one, that you would know the content better. At the end of this series, if you do not understand 1 John better now than you did when we started, before you'd ever actually done any kind of serious study in 1 John, well, then I failed a little bit, right? So I want us to understand the content better, right? Not only do I want to give you information about this content, I want to give you a method of study. And we're going to talk about how we're supposed to read the Bible and how I think it is most effective for us to study the Bible, not just reading. But I want to give you a method for study, because if you understand how to read 1 John, then you can import all that information and you can then transpose it over onto 2 John or 3 John or the Gospel of John or 1 Peter or 2 Peter. Right? I want to give you something that is not just 1 John specific, that you can then import and then press into service in some other book whenever you were studying there. But in order to do that, we have to have like an actual method of how we approach these things. Yeah. And then thirdly, the big thing that I really want us to understand is that I am wanting to give you the space and the expectation that I'm going to equip you to share this information with somebody else. Now, this does not mean that you are going to have to share this information in the next 2 weeks. Like the moment that you learned 1 John chapters 1 verses 1 through 4, the very next day you're going to have to go out and go share it. But I do have this expectation that we would be able to share it in 2 ways. One, that you would be able to share it confidently, that you actually can know that this is what John wrote in 1 John chapter 3, whatever the content that we're covering that week is. I want you to be confident in knowing that you can do it. And I want you to be competent in being able to share it in a wholesome, winsome way. I like to think of it this way, is that whenever we put on this expectation right out the gate of how we are going to teach this information so that you have this expectation to share it, if I tell you up front that I expect you to be able to share this information competently and confidently with somebody you work with, someone who lives in your neighborhood, someone that you work out with, whatever, if I tell you that right up front, you're going to be far more likely to actually share this information when those opportunities arise. You would definitely be able to do that more than if I never told you from the beginning that this is what we were planning on doing. So I don't want to spring this on you in the middle of the semester and make it like a gotcha that now you got to go share this. Like, I'm telling you right out the gate that my explicit goal is for you to know 1 John better, to be able to understand how to read literature in the Bible of this same genre, so the epistles. I want you to understand how to read those as well, and then be able to share that information with someone else. Because if we don't set the expectation early on, what we will do is we will view all of these videos, all this audio content, we will view all these teaching sessions as just a repository where we can accrue information and facts. That is not what we are called to do as Christians. We are not called to just accrue information and hold on to it for ourselves. We are called to be able to be a witness to Jesus, for Jesus in the world around us. And that means that we're going to have to open our mouth and we're going to have to explain some things. And so our goal is to just not understand the conversation that we're having in 1 John, but then also how to have that conversation outside of 1 John with our friends. Yeah? So that's what my goals on teaching are. But now I want to talk about how this series is going to be different than the ones that we have had, especially in the last semester. Whenever we were talking about the storyline of the Old Testament, that was a whole lot of me lecturing. It was a whole lot of me standing and delivering. We had some back and forth, but I really want to emphasize a couple of things. Number one, I want to focus not just on the content of 1 John, but also how we can apply it in our context. And what I mean by our context is where we live, where we work, and where we play. So when I tell you that I expect us to be able to share this confidently and competently, I expect us to be able to share that in those contexts. We want to apply what John says in 1 John to the culture in which we inhabit. We want to be able to share these things so that we are not just these people who are observers of culture, but that we are actually speaking truth into culture. That is the goal. And so we are not just going to focus on the content, but we're going to focus on how to apply it into our context. Sometimes that means that we're going to be diving into hot button issues. Sometimes it means we're going to be making really simple applications that are kind of difficult for us to do. Yeah. So number one, we're not just going to focus on the content, but also the context. The second thing that we're going to do is different this semester is that I am going to be encouraging us to memorize portions of our text. I want us to memorize portions from each chapter. The number one verse, we're going to start off real easy. In fact, many of us already know it, is going to be 1 John chapter 1, verse 9. Where we're going to talk about how there is this confession and there is forgiveness of sins and that that God will cleanse us of all unrighteousness. We're going to focus in on memorizing individual portions from each chapter. And the reason that we want to do that is because if you have that verse in your pocket, when it comes time to share competently and confidently, if you got that in your pocket, you can just let that roll right out of your mouth and the conversation just doesn't even skip a beat. And so we're going to be focusing on, with an expectation of, we are going to rehearse in public, in our group, different verses that we are memorizing. And we're going to do it in different translations. I'm not going to impose a certain translation that we all have to use, but we are going to be focusing on memorizing the text. All right. So number one, we're going to focus on not just the content, but how it applies to our context. Number two, we're going to focus on how to memorize. And then number three, we're going to have a much elevated importance of discussion within the group. And so there are going to be times where I'm going to write out discussion questions the week before for the content that's coming up the next week. When that happens, I want you to look over those questions. I want you to read the text. I want you to read ahead. I want you to get to the point where we are actively working through the material and thinking through our answers before I ask them on that Wednesday night. And so I'm going to have that stuff. We're going to have a lot of this stuff is going to be provided for you. Not every single week is going to have a heavy emphasis on a discussion question that you need to prepare for. But for the weeks that actually does happen, I'm going to have the expectation that we're going to have looked over that. And I promise you that if we endeavor to actually prepare, then that will make it a whole lot better for us. So speaking of that, let's talk about how to actually prepare for each week. Now, I'm going to add a different wrinkle here, that not just with the scripture memory and the discussion questions, those are going to be fairly simple, but I want to spend a lot of time talking about the method of reading that I want you to employ. So I want you to prepare every single week by reading ahead. One of the benefits of doing 1 John with a letter that's only 5 chapters long is that it's fairly small. Each week, we're only looking at about 6 verses each week. The longest one is about 8 or 9 verses, and then everything else is either 5, 6, 7, or 8, right? So we're going to be able to atomize some of this text and look at it in very small portions, but we're also going to need to see the context, which is where our method of reading comes in. This is how I want us to read every single week. I'm going to publish a schedule. I'm going to show you that here in a bit as to what we are covering each week. Each week, I want you to read the section of the text that we are assigning to cover according to the schedule. Each week, you read that section. As soon as you are done reading that section, whatever it may be, you stop and you go back to the first part of verse 1 of that chapter, and you read the entire chapter. After you get done reading the entire chapter, you stop again and you go all the way back to chapter 1, verse 1, and you read the entire letter. So let me give the example. On week 8, whenever we get on March 13th, we're going to be in the middle of 1 John chapter 3. We're going to read, according to this method, we're going to read verses 11 through 18. And what I want you to do is read 1 John chapter 3, 11 through 18 slowly. make observations, write down questions, write down things that stand out to you, good, bad, or indifferent. I want you to do that slowly. Once you get done with chapter 3, verses 11 through 18, you stop, and then you go back to read all of 1 John chapter 3. Once you read all of 1 John chapter 3, what you're looking for is you're going to read a little bit quicker, but you are looking for connections within that chapter to see how John's thought works in that whole section, right? So he's going to develop an idea throughout chapter 3, and I want you to be able to trace how he is developing this argument and these ideas and how they're coming out in that chapter, yeah? And then once you get done with that chapter, you can now read a little bit quicker, and you're going to read the entire letter. And what you're looking for when you're reading through the entire letter is you're looking for places where in chapter 1, it's going to relate to the content that's in chapter 3, verses 11 through 18. And then when you get to chapter 5 and you're reading through it, I want you to be able to look back and see where John established this back in chapter 3, verses 11 through 18. You start by reading the section, read the whole section slowly, stop, go back to the beginning of that chapter in its context, read the whole chapter a little bit quicker, seeing how the argument flows, stop. Then you go to chapter 1, verse 1 and read all the way through the end of chapter 5, and you are looking for how that those portions from the text that we are focusing on are found in other places in John. In 1 John, yeah? So this is a little bit different, but I promise you, if you work through it in this way, there's going to be a lot of benefits. Number one, here's the first benefit. It's only going to take 15 to 20 minutes, maybe 30 if you're a slower reader. We're only talking 30 minutes out of your day to get a greater grasp of God's word for us in content and in our context, because we're going to be working through discussion questions. There's going to be memorization. There's all those things are going to be piling on. I promise you, this is going to help us. Read the section, the chapter, the whole letter. We can do it. Additionally, whenever we're reading through this, one of our goals and expectations is that we're going to focus on scripture memory. If you read the section, chapter, and then the whole letter, the way that I have talked about over the 15 weeks that we are working through this material, I promise you that if you do that, depending on how you count, you will have read 1 John anywhere between 15 and 21 times, depending on how you count the chapters, the verses, how we cover it in there on Wednesday nights. You will have read it about 15 to 20 times. Just by osmosis, your brain is going to start absorbing some of these really big themes and ideas and words that we're going to be explaining throughout the sessions. I promise you, one, you will have a greater grasp on the content, you will have a greater grasp of understanding the argument, and you're actually going to start memorizing some of this stuff, right? So do the reading in this method, and then if we have a memorization text, rehearse it. Just run through it a couple of times. We're going to be picking some very well-known verses and ones that are pretty pivotal for John's argument in 1 John. So do the reading. Whatever the memorization text is for each chapter, start rehearsing those things. And once you have them in your head, I promise you, it only takes 2 or 3 minutes to rehearse these so that it just gets locked into your mind brain and you never let go of it. Yeah? Do the reading, rehearse the memorization, and then if we have any discussion questions that I gave you, just consider those. Start thinking about those after you've done the reading, after you've considered the memorization, after you've worked through the section, the chapter, and the whole book. Yeah? Simple as that. Really as simple as that. That is what I want us to do, and that's how this is going to be a little bit different this semester and how we're going to prepare for those things. Yeah? So now let us turn to the part that is probably the most beneficial for the background information that we're going to have in our head. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here, but I want to give us some of those specifics that I know that we always have to cover when it comes to doing new themes and new series like this. And so the first thing I want to just say, when it comes to 1 John, you may have guessed it, but John the Apostle is our author. There is a string of interpretation throughout history that maybe John the Apostle, the beloved disciple, wasn't the author. I reject that. We know that John wrote the Gospel of John, and he wrote that to proclaim Jesus as the Savior. He wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. so he wrote those to confirm the saints. He is affirming in you, this is how we know we are believers. And then he wrote the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, that is like this coronation of Christ, right? So he is proclaiming Christ as the Savior. He's affirming the saints in their knowledge of Jesus as the Savior. And then he coronates Christ in Revelation. So we know that he wrote this, and there is a unique twist that I'm going to take on this. I believe in 1 John, there is an assumption that the reader is familiar with the Gospel of John. And we'll get into that here in a second because it's written sometime between 80 and 90 AD. There's a pretty decent chance that Gospel of John was already circulated by this point. And there are plenty of points where John is going to assume some kind of familiarity with the Gospel of John. Let me give you an example of that. In 1 John chapter 2, John is going to write about this command to love, and then there's a big poem, and then he actually gives us the command a little bit later on. But when he's talking about this old command versus a new command, that's actually drawn directly from the words of Jesus. And so whether or not John is actually assuming that we are familiar with exactly what he wrote, he at a minimum is assuming that we are familiar with the commands that Christ had issued to him and his fellow disciples, the fellow apostles that he had when he was kicking around in the dirt with Jesus. He assumes at a minimum that you're familiar with those commands. I don't think it's a huge leap to then say he assumes you're familiar with the content of the Gospel of John. Either way, this is not a huge point. This is actually a minor point, but I want to throw out there that this is beneficial because we worked through the Gospel of John last spring, and now we're working through 1 John. And I think that those two are connected in some way. So I'm not going to linger too much on that. I just want to throw it out there for you. But this is the big deal. What is it that John is doing in the gospel, in 1 John? Well, what he is doing is he is combating errors that have crept into the church by encouraging his children. And what he means by children is those who are really believers in Jesus, who are members of the church, who are faithful followers and disciples of Christ. That's what he's talking about. And so he's going to be encouraging them, he's going to be addressing them, and he's going to be combating these errors. All right. So there are two main errors, and I'm going to just throw them both up there. One, there are theological errors, and I'll talk about all those words for Docetism, Gnosticism, and Corinthianism here in just a moment. And so there's these theological errors with false teaching is creeping in. And then there's these ethical errors that they're just not doing the right things. They have this lovelessness. They have this indifference to sin. And so John is going to address each of those in turn. So let me give us a little bit of information as to like the theological error that is floating around in the world. There's these three ideas that are really connected, but it's kind of hard to tell exactly which one John is addressing at different points in 1 John. So Docetism, let me tell you what that is. Docetism comes from the Greek word that means to seem. And what this idea of Docetism is that Jesus was not really a man. He seemed like a man, but he was altogether different. There's no way that he could actually be a real human man because if he is in fact the Christ, that means that he is divine, and there's no way that a divine being can be a man. He can only seem to be a man. And so he kind of pulls on these different appearances of God in the Old Testament, that he appears as an angel or like a man, but he's not really a man. And at the end of the day, we reject this because we believe, according to John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then you skip down to verse 14 in John chapter 1, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Like, we are talking about Jesus didn't seem like a man. Jesus, who is the Christ, who didn't seem like a man, he was a man. And so this idea is actually rejected by three early church fathers. Don't need to worry about them. Docetism, he seemed like a man. The second idea is Gnosticism. And again, this comes from a Greek word, gnosko, which means to know, right? And so the emphasis in Gnosticism is that there is this secret kind of knowledge that only particular people can either understand and comprehend, or that it gets revealed to them. And the main idea with Gnosticism is that Jesus revealed a secret knowledge to his disciples and his apostles, and it's incumbent upon us to discover that secret knowledge. And there's different ways that we can get there. But one of the other major trends that happens with Gnosticism is that there is this fundamental belief that matter and physical things are bad, and that spiritual things or knowledge are good. So in this vein, there is this really drastic bent away from the suffering and death of Jesus as the Christ because, well, that doesn't seem compelling because matter is bad. Like, who really cares if Jesus died? That's just a body and it's garbage anyway. It's all about the spirituality. It's all about the truth that comes out from that. And we have to reject that. And so whether or not John is addressing Gnosticism or some very early form of Gnosticism. A lot of times I'm just going to refer to it as this proto-Gnosticism. Either way, those ideas are starting to line up, and they make a lot of sense whenever we start reading in 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, whenever John is talking about that which we saw and which we touched and which we are now delivering to you and speaking to you about. Like, they're really hitting on some really key ideas about Jesus's real body and that he was a real man. Okay. And so that is Docetism and Gnosticism. And then the third one is this Corinthianism or Cerinthianism. And so Cerinthus was a man who seemed to be under the sway of this teaching of either Docetism or Gnosticism. And this was a guy that we know actually existed around the time of the end of the first century. And so that puts him at a time whenever he may have been teaching around when John wrote 1 John. And so the timeline lines up, and what he actually thought, Cerinthius, what he thought was that Jesus was not really born of a virgin. Like, that can't really be the case. Like, we just know that's not how God works. And not only was Jesus not born of a virgin, but Jesus, who is the Christ, is not initially the Christ. That at Jesus's baptism, that is when the Christ descends on Jesus the man at his baptism in the form of a dove, and now he is the Christ, and he lives those next 3 years doing ministry as the Christ, and then right before his execution on the cross, that is when the Christ leaves Jesus the man, and that Jesus actually died, but the Christ lives on. And then there's these other variant forms of Docetism about the bodily resurrection of Jesus, that whether or not that was actually the Christ or Jesus or whether it seemed like him, neither here nor there. But you can see how these three ideas of Docetism, that Jesus just seemed like a man even though he really was divine, or that this matter is bad and spirituality or knowledge is good in Gnosticism or Proto-Gnosticism or Cerinthianism, all three of those things are kind of binding together because they share this one fundamental error that John is going to address over and over again. We're going to see that in just a moment. Yeah. So those are the theological errors. But then there are these ethical errors, and those ethical errors are that there just seems to be this lovelessness that the people there in Ephesus or Smyrna or wherever it was that John was writing to at this church, they seem to just not love one another very well. They don't live out the commands of Christ to love one another as well as they should. And because of that, they have this indifference to sin that kind of creeps in and infects everything else. And so we'll address those things. Those are much easier for us to comprehend. And so I want to work through now, not just the background information that kind of sits at those peripheries, which we kind of don't understand. And I want to address some things that we actually do understand because John explicitly tells us. And so what we're going to talk about now is that there are 4 purposes that John has that he tells us explicitly in the actual text of 1 John. He tells us 4 of these purposes, and there are 3 tests that we're going to keep coming back over and over again to. So here are those 4 purposes. You can find them in chapter 1, verse 4, chapter 2, verse 1, chapter 2, verse 26, and chapter 5, verse 13. Let me read those for us here. The first purpose in 1 John 1:4. John says, "We are writing these things. I'm writing you these things so that our joy may be complete." So he is really focusing in on this idea that there can be real joy found with theological truth and ethical truth that comes from Jesus. And I want you to experience that joy with us. And that's why I'm writing you. The second purpose he gives us is in chapter 2, verse 1. John says, "My little children." There it is. He's addressing his church members. "My little children, I am writing you these things to you so that you may not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous or the righteous one." So he says, I'm writing to you so that you don't sin. But even if you do, I'm also writing by extension so that you know that if you fall into sin, that there is forgiveness because you have an advocate who is with you or before you with God, that he is there to advocate on your behalf because he loves you and you belong to him. That's our second purpose. The third purpose is in chapter 2, verse 26, when John writes, I write these things to you about those who are trying to deceive you. And we see that he's talking about these ideas of the theological error that he is addressing, that he knows there are people who are false teachers who are trying to work their way into the church. And he is saying, no, I'm writing to you about them because they're trying to deceive you, but this is the truth. Don't be swayed from it. Yeah. And then our fourth purpose he gives in chapter 5, verse 13, he says, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life. And so we see here that John is really focused on not just these theological errors, but also these ethical errors, that I want you to have this joy. I want you to know that even if you fall into sin, there is forgiveness and that you have an advocate at the right hand of God, namely Jesus Christ, who is the righteous one, right? So he's addressing not just the theological error, but he's also addressing the ethical errors there. And he tells us that with his purposes. Now, the way that he's going to work out those four different purposes across these 5 chapters is he's going to give us that content, but he's also going to give us 3 basic tests. And those 3 tests are the test of obedience, which we see there in chapter 2, 3 through 6, this test of love that is going to be in chapter 2, 7 through 11, which actually runs through 17. We'll get there. And then the third test is this test of belief or doctrine. That's at the end of chapter 2. So in chapter 2, he's giving us 3 different tests. The test of, a test of obedience, of love, and right belief or doctrine. And so if you even look at the graphics that we have here within our sermon series, you see those 3 different circles. And at the end of the day, those 3 things are linked together. That's what these 3 circles are representing there in the graphics that we have. Those 3 things are these 3 tests because they are about what we believe, doctrine, what we actually do in our obedience, and what we do as far as like our internal bent and direction towards God, which is love, right? And at the end of the day, he gives us 3 tests, but really there's 1 test. And we're going to talk all about that. Just hold on from there. So John is going to give us these 4 purposes, these 3 tests, and then there's 2 other big points that I really want to throw out for us. Number 1, John is going to write in what I'm calling a circular fashion so that he can amplify his points. So let me explain what this means. If you've ever read 1 John before and you've thought, man, this really sounds familiar. Like, why does chapter 2 sound eerily familiar in chapter 3 and 4? Like, why does it seem like he's using the exact same material? Partly because he is. And let me explain that. He is using one point of the conversation. He's going to bring it around. He's going to talk about all the details. He's going to bring us right back to the point where he began about obedience. And then the next time that he talks about it, he's going to use a different bent and he's going to amplify that conversation by coming back around to that point and applying it in a different way. Let me explain how this works. When I was in Iraq the second time, I did a lot of source meets, and I would go meet with Iraqi people out in the sector, and I would get information from them. And a lot of times they would speak in these circular patterns. I would ask them, hey, can you tell me about the guy in the blue truck at this checkpoint? I think his name is whatever. Can you tell me about him? And then whoever I was talking to would say, oh yeah, the guy, his name is this. He drives a blue truck. He lives over there. And that would be all they would say. So I would ask a follow-up question. Hey, can you tell me more? How did he get into the checkpoint? And their answer would be, oh, you mean the guy, his name is this. He lives over there. He drives a blue truck. He got into the checkpoint process by doing this. Okay, when did he get into the checkpoint process? And they would answer by, oh, you mean the guy who drives the blue truck, who lives over there, who got into the checkpoint at this process? He got into this checkpoint at this time. And I found that incredibly frustrating because I just want to know the answer to the question I just asked. Don't tell me about the guy and his name, where he lives, the blue truck, at the checkpoint. I've already established all that. Just give me the detail that I'm asking for. And what is something that I'd missed, and eventually I started picking up on, that is just a way of not only storytelling, but it's a way of amplifying the information that is now being added into the conversation. So whenever John is starting to throw in these different illustrations about loving people and then hating each other, and that turns you into a liar and you make God a liar, he's hitting all these different connection points because he's not just hitting an old point and he's just saying it again. He's amplifying it and he's applying it in a new way. So when we get into our content, there are going to be points where it sounds radically similar to what he just said. But what our job is to see the nuance, to look at the little tiny pieces to see how John is actually amplifying the whole message. Yeah? All right, that's enough about that. So I want to say that this is a big deal that we need to see that, yeah, it's going to sound repetitious, and I'm going to give us some answers as to why that is. So not only is John going to write in this circular fashion, he is also, I just mentioned, going to be adding in a bunch of these images, these clear contrasts. Let me give you an example of what I mean by these clear contrasts that he then begins to fiddle with the images. In 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, this is what John says. This is the message we have heard from him and proclaimed to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. So you can see there that there are several key ideas: darkness, light, truth, walking, and lying. And what John will start to do is you'll have light and dark as like these key ideas, and then truth and lying. And then he's going to start substituting light for lying. Or light and truth, and darkness and lying, and love and light, and hate and darkness, right? He's going to use these similar ideas, and he's just going to mix them all up. And our job is to understand not just symbolically what he's representing and what he is intending for us to understand, but our job at some level is actually to catalog all of these images so that whenever he starts pulling and playing with these images and he mixes them for his own purposes, that we don't get confused, right? So this is the last thing I'll say. We also need to understand in 1 John, this is probably one of the hardest things that we need to get, but I promise you it's going to be real simple when we get there. We have to understand John's use of semantic range. What does John mean when he uses this one specific word, right? Semantic range means that there is a word that can mean this in this context, and then in another context it means something else, and then in a different context that range gets even a little bit bigger, and then in a different context it gets even bigger. Let me explain it this way. I want you to understand and think about what I mean by saying the exact same word in a different way in a different context. I'm happy, dude. I'm sad, dude. I'm confused, dude. Or I'm just like angry, dude. You see how those four different instances using the exact same word, dude, can mean very different things given their context. John is going to do this with the words with truth. He's going to use the word world, cosmos. He's even going to use the word we. Who does he mean by we? There are multiple options, and at different times he seems to be mixing what he means. And so we have to understand John's use of semantic range. He's using the exact same word, but he's using it in different ways. And it's incumbent upon us to understand what those purposes are. We will get to that. I promise you it sounds crazy now. Once you get there, super easy. All right. So that being said, this is what we need to know, the four purposes, these three tests. You can look on there on the screen, write those down, start working through those. Some of them may end up being our memorization verses. Just think about that. And we need to understand how John writes in a circular fashion. Yeah, there it is. That is our background information. That is what we needed from 1 John. But before we get there, I'll have this in the show notes linked. We'll have it on our website. This is actually the schedule that we're going to be working through whenever we get to 1 John this semester. And so we're going to be doing basically 4 or 5 verses early on, and then we might balloon up to like 8 or 9. But we're covering a very small amount of material pretty much every time that we meet. That's our schedule. We'll have all of that ready to roll whenever we get to meeting on January 24th. All this stuff will be there. We'll be ready to roll. I'm thankful that you've hung around for this video or listened to the audio on our podcast feed. If you've got any questions, you can feel free to holler at me here at the church, call me, send me an email, shoot a text, whatever. I don't care. Send me a carrier pigeon, smoke signal, whatever. Let me know. I am excited about working through 1 John. This was actually the first Bible study that I ever taught. In fact, I've taught that Bible study using this Bible, and you can see that this Bible is quite in a massive state of disrepair because I have used it so much, and my notes are quite copious here. In fact, the edges of the paper, 1 John, are kind of brown from where I've just handled it so much. I love 1 John. I think it is an incredible book that helps us live life in not just the right way theologically, but also in ethically and in this matter of obedience and how we're to love one another. It teaches us so clearly what it is that we're supposed to do. So all I want to say now is that I'm excited. I look forward to seeing everyone on January 24th whenever we actually start working through this material. And until then, I just want to say do good and don't sin.